Hey everyone, it's Bob Crossan for Water World and Wastewater Digest. I am joined today by Jenn Mester. She is Compliance Program Manager for Encamp, and we're going to talk about RCRA for water and wastewater utilities and common violations that you should be avoiding.
Hi, Bob. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time. It's fantastic that we can talk about this subject because I know just how important it is for some of these facilities, especially as the regulatory environment is constantly changing around PFAS, especially.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, why don't you give me a quick overview on how RCRA impacts water and wastewater facilities? We were talking just a little bit before the call about how it's not all that different for both sides of that aisle.
Awesome. Yeah. So RCRA comes into play anytime you have hazardous waste. So when you start thinking about wastewater utilities and water utilities, you're going to have hazardous waste, which are mostly going to be chemical waste, because when you think about your output and what you're putting out of those facilities on both sides, it's not hazardous. It's water, it's wastewater, which is being discharged through an NPDES permit. It's drinking water, which is being put out into your community. So when you think about RCRA, you're not really thinking about those discharges. You're thinking about all of the operational waste that come out of running these types of facilities. So you need to determine your waste. I mean, that's a big thing is with any industry, but even in these industries, you need to determine if you have hazardous waste, you need to determine what your wastes are, and you need to characterize them. So that's a huge impact on those industries because there could be a lot of different wastes.
Yeah, it sounds like obviously chemicals are a big part of this. There's a lot of chemicals used in water treatment and in wastewater treatment, and the way that you handle those, it sounds like it would fall under RCRA for the most part. Am I understanding that correct?
Absolutely. So thinking about a wastewater facility, think about how big it is because wastewater treatment plants are not, there are small wastewater treatment plants that are municipal, but they're usually big. They're usually covering a community. And some of them are almost like small little cities. They've got multiple buildings, they have operations within those facilities. So think about having testing laboratories. You're testing your water, you have a lot of chemicals in there. Think about having things like maintenance facilities, whether it's maintenance for your equipment in your plant or maintenance for your vehicles that you use at your plant. You also have a lot of waste that are coming out of there. I think those are super overlooked things when you think about the operations of these plants and super important when it comes to hazardous waste.
Yeah. Well, speaking of these violations and whatnot, what are some of the common ones that you recognize happen within water and wastewater facilities, and how should those plant managers be looking at this issue?
So I think one big thing, the biggest thing that comes out of these is waste determinations. And there's a few different ways you can go with those violations. But when a regulator comes on your site, they want to make sure that you've identified what all of your wastes are, identified if you have hazardous waste, how they're hazardous, characterize them, and then also have documentation for those wastes. And then that goes for non-hazardous waste too, in terms of if you have non-hazardous waste, you need to show that they are non-hazardous. So when the regulator comes on your site to inspect you, you need to make sure that you can pull out your documentation and say, hey, we test that, we analyze it, we know that it's non-hazardous. So that's probably the biggest thing right off the bat is if you don't have your waste identified, characterized, and documented, you're going to have a violation. That's a huge thing.
Yeah, paperwork that people generally don't want to do.
Absolutely. Another huge violation that you can get. So when the inspector comes on your site, they're going to say, hey, show me where you store your hazardous waste. So proper on-site management is key. If you aren't properly managing your waste, you're going to have all kinds of opportunities for violations. So that might be things like labeling your containers properly, having dates on them properly like you need to, having them what the regulators call secured closed. So if you have a drum, you need to have that drum ring actually fastened. That's a huge thing. So any of those types of things in terms of how you're storing it. And then that also goes into universal waste. So think of the size and scope of a municipal water treatment, a municipal sewage treatment plant. They're huge. So think of all of the light bulbs and the batteries from things like forklifts or backup power supplies, because that's critical in wastewater and water infrastructure.
Hmm.
You have to properly handle and manage all of those things. And those are universal wastes.
Oh, okay. So what are some of the best practices that that are recommended for utilities to follow, for owners to implement, to make sure that they're, keeping up with all of these things? Is there like a flow chart of things that they should be following? What are some of the steps they should be taking?
Absolutely. There's a lot of things. And again, I think we start with identifying your waste. That's the biggest thing is identifying what all you have, making sure that you know what it is, know how to categorize it, know what it falls into.
Mhm.
So that's one big, not necessarily easy thing, but definitely something you should do. Another thing is training your employees. And that does a couple of things for you. So if you're running a big wastewater treatment plant, make sure those employees are trained what they're dealing with and what they need to do with it. So not only do you then meet the requirement of training your employees under RCRA, but if you have employees working in areas where they're generating hazardous waste, if they know how to identify that hazardous waste and how to treat that hazardous waste on site in terms of how they manage it, then they are given the tools that they need to succeed and help you manage that. And
Yeah.
I think specifically about areas where you're generating non-routine waste. So think about your vehicle maintenance operations on your site. Think about your just general facility maintenance operations, where you might have drums of some sort of solvent or oil or whatever it is. Some of those things may be hazardous. And those people, if they're properly trained, they can contain it and handle it in those areas.
Yeah. Are there certain tools that they can consider beyond simply pen and paper? I imagine that pen and paper is kind of like how it's been handled for years, but with this transition to a lot of digital tools, I imagine there's some new opportunities there for easier management of this type of paperwork and tracking of everything.
Absolutely. Obviously we've all done it via pen and paper, and that's hard. It's super hard. You're starting to get management systems. Actually, Encamp is a management system where we
Mhm.
help manage paperwork and waste and things like that as well. So you can essentially enter your information in, your documentation is maintained, and then that information is used to populate reports. But there's other systems out there too, and other technology companies that are starting to do bits and pieces of these things in order to help, people on site organize and manage their waste, because it's hard. There's a lot going on, there's a lot of moving pieces, and there's a lot of requirements.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Jen. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about RCRA today and about some of the things that people should be looking out for on the wastewater and water side, and really appreciate your expertise on this subject.
Thank you. I appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, for everyone who's watching, check out our video description below. We'll have some links to some other resources for you down there. And once more to Jen, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.